Chapter 11. Uncle Teddy. For a week, Dan only moved from bed to sofa, a long week and a hard one, for the hurt foot was very painful at times. The quiet days very wearisome to the active lad, longing to be out enjoying the summer weather, and especially difficult was it to be patient. But Dan did his best, and everyone helped him in their various ways. So the time passed, and he was rewarded at last by hearing the doctor say, on Saturday morning, "This foot is doing better than I expected. Give the lad the crutch this afternoon, and let him stump about the house a little." "Hooray!" shouted Nat, and raced away to tell the other boys the good news. Everybody was very glad, and after dinner the whole flock assembled to behold Dan crutch himself up and down the hall a few times, before he settled in the porch to hold a sort of levee. He was much pleased at the interest and goodwill shown him, and brightened up more and more every minute, for the boys came to pay their respects, the little girls fussed about him with stools and cushions, and Teddy watched over him as if he was a frail creature unable to do anything for himself. They were still sitting and standing about the steps when a carriage stopped at the gate. A hat was waved from it, and with a shout of, "Uncle Teddy! Uncle Teddy!" Rob scampered down the avenue as fast as his short legs would carry him. All the boys but Dan ran after him to see who should be first to open the gate, and in a moment the carriage drove up with boys swarming all over it, while Uncle Teddy sat laughing in the midst with his little daughter on his knee. "Stop the triumphal car and let Jupiter descend," he said, and jumping out, ran up the steps to meet Mrs. Bear, who stood smiling and clapping her hands like a girl. "How goes it, Teddy?" "All right, Joe." Then they shook hands, and Mr. Lorry put Bess into her aunt's arms, saying, as the child hugged her tight, "Goldilocks wanted to see you so much that I ran away with her, for I was quite pining for a sight of you myself. We want to play with your boys for an hour or so, and to see how the old woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children she did not know what to do is getting on." "I'm so glad. Play away, and don't get into mischief," answered Mrs. Joe, as the lads crowded round the pretty child, admiring her long golden hair, dainty dress, and lofty ways. For the little princess, as they called her, allowed no one to kiss her, but sat smiling down upon them and graciously patting their heads with her little white hands. They all adored her, especially Rob, who considered her a sort of doll and dared not touch her lest she should break, but worshipped her at a respectful distance, made happy by an occasional mark of favor from her little highness. As she immediately demanded to see Daisy's kitchen, she was borne off by Mrs. Joe, with a train of small boys following. The others, all but Nat and Demi, ran away to the menagerie and gardens to have all in order, for Mr. Lorry always took a general survey and looked disappointed if things were not flourishing. Standing on the steps, he turned to Dan, saying, like an old acquaintance, though he had only seen him once or twice before, "How's the foot?" "Better, sir." "Rather tired of the house, aren't you?" "Guess I am." And Dan's eyes roved away to the green hills and woods where he longed to be. "Suppose we take a little turn before the others come back. That big, easy carriage will be quite safe and comfortable, and a breath of fresh air will do you good. Get a cushion and a shawl, Demi, and let's carry Dan off." The boys thought it a capital joke, and Dan looked delighted, but asked with an unexpected burst of virtue, "Will Mrs. Bear like it?" "Oh, yes. We settled all that a minute ago." "You didn't say anything about it, so I don't see how you could," said Demi inquisitively. "We have a way of sending messages to one another without any words. It is a great improvement on the telegraph." "I know. It's eyes. I saw you lift your eyebrows and nod toward the carriage, and Mrs. Bear laughed and nodded back again," cried Nat, who was quite at his ease with kind Mr. Lorry by this time. "Right. Now then, come on." And in a minute, Dan found himself settled in the carriage, his foot on a cushion on the seat opposite, nicely covered with a shawl, which fell down from the upper regions in a most mysterious manner, just when they wanted it. Demi climbed up to the box beside Peter, the black coachman. Nat sat next Dan in the place of honor, while Uncle Teddy would sit opposite, to take care of the foot, he said, but really that he might study the faces before him, both so happy, yet so different, for Dan's was square and brown and strong, while Nat's was long and fair and rather weak, but very amiable, with its mild eyes and good forehead. "By the way, I've got a book somewhere here that you may like to see," said the oldest boy of the party, diving under the seat and producing a book which made Dan exclaim, "Oh, by George, isn't that a stunner?" as he turned the leaves, and saw fine plates of butterflies and birds and every sort of interesting insect, colored like life. He was so charmed that he forgot his thanks, but Mr. Lorry did not mind, and was quite satisfied to see the boy's eager delight, and to hear his exclamations over certain old friends as he came to them. Nat leaned on his shoulder to look, and Demi turned his back to the horses and let his feet dangle inside the carriage, so that he might join in the conversation. When they got among the beetles, Mr. Lorry took a curious little object out of his vest pocket, and laying it in the palm of his hand, said, "There's a beetle that is thousands of years old." And then, while the lads examined the queer stone bug that looked so old and gray, he told them how it came out of the wrappings of a mummy, after lying for ages in a famous tomb. Finding them interested, he went on to tell about the Egyptians, and the strange and splendid ruins they have left behind them, the Nile, and how he sailed up the mighty river with the handsome dark men to work his boat, how he shot alligators, saw wonderful beasts and birds, and afterwards crossed the desert on a camel, who pitched him about like a ship in a storm. "Uncle Teddy tells stories most as well as Grandpa," said Demi approvingly when the tale was done, and the boy's eyes asked for more. "Thank you," said Mr. Lorry, quite soberly, for he considered Demi's praise worth having, for children are good critics in such cases, and to suit them is an accomplishment that anyone may be proud of. "Here's another trifle or two that I tucked into my pocket as I was turning over my traps to see if I had anything that would amuse Dan." And Uncle Teddy produced a fine arrowhead and a string of wampum. "Oh, tell about the Indians," cried Demi, who was fond of playing wigwam. "Dan knows lots about them," added Nat. "More than I do, I dare say. Tell us something." And Mr. Lorry looked as interested as the other two. "Mr. Hyde told me. He's been among 'em, and can talk their talk, and likes 'em," began Dan, flattered by their attention, but rather embarrassed by having a grown-up listener. "What is wampum for?" asked curious Demi, from his perch. The others asked questions likewise, and before he knew it, Dan was reeling off all Mr. Hyde had told him, as they sailed down the river a few weeks before. Mr. Lorry listened well, but found the boy more interesting than the Indians, for Mrs. Joe had told him about Dan, and he rather took a fancy to the wild lad who ran away as he himself had often longed to do, and who was slowly getting tamed by pain and patience. "I've been thinking that it would be a good plan for you fellows to have a museum of your own, a place in which to collect all the curious and interesting things that you find and make and have given you. Mrs. Joe is too kind to complain, but it is rather hard for her to have the house littered up with all sorts of rattletraps, half a pint of door-bugs in one of her best vases, for instance, a couple of dead bats nailed up in the back entry, wasps' nests tumbling down on people's heads, and stones lying round everywhere, enough to pave the avenue. There are not many women who would stand that sort of thing, are there now?" As Mr. Lorry spoke with a merry look in his eyes, the boys laughed and nudged one another, for it was evident that someone told tales out of school, else how could he know of the existence of these inconvenient treasures? "Where can we put them, then?" said Demi. crossing his legs and leaning down to argue the question. In the old carriage house. But it leaks, and there isn't any window nor any place to put things, and it's all dust and cobwebs, began Nat. Wait till Gibbs and I have touched it up a bit, and then see how you like it. He is to come over on Monday to get it ready. Then next Saturday I shall come out, and we will fix it up, and make the beginning, at least, of a fine little museum. Everyone can bring his things and have a place for them, and Dan is to be the head man, because he knows most about such matters, and it will be quiet, pleasant work for him now that he can't knock about much. Won't that be jolly? Cried Nat, while Dan smiled all over his face and had not a word to say, but hugged his book and looked at Mr. Lorry as if he thought him one of the greatest public benefactors that ever blessed the world. Shall I go round again, sir? Asked Peter as they came to the gate, after 2 slow turns about the half-mile triangle. No, we must be prudent, else we can't come again. I must go over the premises, take a look at the carriage house, and have a little talk with Mrs. Joe before I go. And having deposited Dan on his sofa to rest and enjoy his book, Uncle Teddy went off to have a frolic with the lads, who were raging about the place in search of him. Leaving the little girls to mess upstairs, Mrs. Bear sat down by Dan and listened to his eager account of the drive till the flock returned, dusty, warm, and much excited about the new museum, which everyone considered the most brilliant idea of the age. I always wanted to endow some sort of an institution, and I am going to begin with this, said Mr. Lorry, sitting down on a stool at Mrs. Joe's feet. You have endowed one already. What do you call this? And Mrs. Joe pointed to the happy-faced lads who had camped upon the floor about them. I call it a very promising bear garden, and I'm proud to be a member of it. Did you know I was the head boy in this school? He asked, turning to Dan and changing the subject skillfully, for he hated to be thanked for the generous things he did. I thought Franz was, answered Dan, wondering what the man meant. Oh dear, no. I'm the first boy Mrs. Joe ever had to take care of, and I was such a bad one that she isn't done with me yet, though she has been working at me for years and years. How old she must be, said Nat innocently. She began early, you see. Poor thing, she was only 15 when she took me, and I led her such a life it's a wonder she isn't wrinkled and gray and quite worn out. And Mr. Lorry looked up at her, laughing. Don't, Teddy, I won't have you abuse yourself so. And Mrs. Joe stroked the curly black head at her knee as affectionately as ever, for, in spite of everything, Teddy was her boy still. If it hadn't been for you, there never would have been a Plumfield. It was my success with you, sir, that gave me courage to try my pet plan. So the boys may thank you for it, and name the new institution the Lawrence Museum, in honor of its founder, won't we, boys? She added, looking very like the lively Joe of old times. We will, shouted the boys, throwing up their hats, for though they had taken them off on entering the house, according to rule, they had been in too much of a hurry to hang them up. I'm as hungry as a bear. Can't I have a cookie? Asked Mr. Lorry, when the shout subsided and he had expressed his thanks by a splendid bow. Trot out and ask Asia for the gingerbread box, Demi. It isn't in order to eat between meals, but on this joyful occasion we won't mind, and have a cookie all round, said Mrs. Joe, and when the box came, she dealt them out with a liberal hand, everyone munching away in a social circle. Suddenly, in the midst of a bite, Mr. Lorry cried out, Bless my heart, I forgot Grandma's bundle, and running out to the carriage, returned with an interesting white parcel, which, being opened, disclosed a choice collection of beasts, birds, and pretty things, cut out of crisp, sugary cake, and baked a lovely brown. There's one for each, and a letter to tell which is whose. Grandma and Hannah made them, and I tremble to think what would have happened to me if I had forgotten to leave them. Then, amid much laughing and fun, the cakes were distributed. A fish for Dan, a fiddle for Nat, a book for Demi, a monkey for Tommy, a flower for Daisy, a hoop for Nan, who had driven twice round the triangle without stopping, a star for Emil, who put on airs because he studied astronomy, and, best of all, an omnibus for Franz, whose great delight was to drive the family bus. Stuffy got a fat pig, and the little folks had birds and cats and rabbits with black-currant eyes. "Now I must go. Where is my Goldilocks? Mamma will come flying out to get her if I'm not back early," said Uncle Teddy, when the last crumb had vanished, which it speedily did, you may be sure. The young ladies had gone into the garden, and while they waited till Franz looked them up, Joe and Laurie stood at the door, talking together. "How does little Giddy-Gaddy come on?" he asked, for Nan's pranks amused him very much, and he was never tired of teasing Joe about her. "Nicely. She is getting quite mannerly, and begins to see the error of her wild ways." "Don't the boys encourage her in them?" "Yes, but I keep talking, and lately she has improved much. You saw how prettily she shook hands with you, and how gentle she was with Bess. Daisy's example has its effect upon her, and I'm quite sure that a few months will work wonders." Here Mrs. Joe's remarks were cut short by the appearance of Nan, tearing round the corner at a breakneck pace, driving a mettlesome team of 4 boys, and followed by Daisy trundling Bess in a wheelbarrow. Hats off, hair flying, whip cracking, and barrow bumping, up they came in a cloud of dust, looking as wild a set of little hoydens as one would wish to see. "So these are the model children, are they? It's lucky I didn't bring Mrs. Curtis out to see your school for the cultivation of morals and manners. She would never have recovered from the shock of this spectacle," said Mr. Lorry, laughing at Mrs. Joe's premature rejoicing over Nan's improvement. "Laugh away. I'll succeed yet, as you used to say at college, quoting some professor. Though the experiment has failed, the principle remains the same," said Mrs. Bear, joining in the merriment. "I'm afraid Nan's example is taking effect upon Daisy instead of the other way. Look at my little princess. She has utterly forgotten her dignity, and is screaming like the rest. Young ladies, what does this mean?" And Mr. Lorry rescued his small daughter from impending destruction, for the 4 horses were champing their bits and curvetting madly all about her, as she sat brandishing a great whip in both hands. "We're having a race, and I beat!" shouted Nan. "I could have run faster, only I was afraid of spilling Bess," screamed Daisy. "Hi, go long!" cried the princess, giving such a flourish with her whip that the horses ran away and were seen no more. "My precious child, come away from this ill-mannered crew before you are quite spoilt. Goodbye, Joe. Next time I come, I shall expect to find the boys making patchwork." "It wouldn't hurt them a bit. I don't give in, mind you, for my experiments always fail a few times before they succeed. Love to Amy and my blessed Marmee," called Mrs. Joe, as the carriage drove away, and the last Mr. Lorry saw of her, she was consoling Daisy for her failure by a ride in the wheelbarrow, and looking as if she liked it.